Hello students, and welcome to the second module titled Is There Myth in the Old Testament? An intentionally provocative title. But let's begin with a prayer. Let's start with Psalm 19 in praise of God's law. B'Shem Ha'Av ve'Aben ve'Ruach HaKodesh Elohim Echad. Amen. The heavens declare the glory of God. The firmament proclaims the works of his hands. Day unto day pours forth speech, night unto night whispers knowledge. There is no speech, no words, their voice is not heard. A report goes forth through all the earth, their message to the ends of the world. He has pitched in them a tent for the sun. It comes forth like a bridegroom from his canopy, and like a hero joyfully runs its course. From one end of the heavens it comes forth, its course runs through to the other, nothing escapes its heat. The law of the Lord is perfect, refreshing the soul. The decree of the Lord is trustworthy, giving wisdom to the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The command of the Lord is clear, enlightening the eye. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. The statutes of the Lord are true, all of them just. More desirable than gold, than a hoard of purest gold, sweeter also than honey, or drippings from the comb. By them your servant is warned, obeying them brings much reward. Who can detect trespasses? Cleanse me from my inadvertent sins. Also from arrogant ones restrain your servant. Let them never control me. Then shall I be blameless, innocent of grave sin. Let the words of my mouth be acceptable, the thoughts of my heart before you, Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. B'Shem Ha'Av ve'Aben ve'Ruach HaKodesh Elohim Echad. Amen. Is there myth in the Bible? In the past, this particular module has stirred up a lot of controversy among my students, and so I've decided to redo it, partly to really enunciate what it is I'm trying to say with this statement, because by the end, you can probably already tell. I'm going to attempt to argue for the fact that there is myth in the Bible, and if that causes you some distress, I hope that by the end of this module, over the next hour or so, I will have set your heart at ease, and you will not want to burn me as a heretic. So let's start off by identifying what I mean by myth. Okay? I think this is really the real crux of the matter, because when we hear myth today, we tend to think of something that is made up or nonsensical, or basically something that is not worthy of belief. So your dentist is not mythical, but the elves in the forest are, right? Mermaids are myths, but seals are not. A rainbow, as light that is refracted by water droplets in the atmosphere, that is not mythical, but a pot guarded by a leprechaun at its end is, right? So that is what our modern usage of the word myth means. But originally, the word mythos in Greek just meant a word, a story, a tale. And that story could be false or it could be true. You could actually write a history and call it a mythos in the original Greek language. Although, already in Greek usage, the word mythos came to be associated eventually with a certain type of story. So we're talking about stories pertaining to the gods, high matter, stories that are not historical because they precede history. That is very important. Myth is not connected to history. It is connected to matters at the beginning of history or at its very end. things that our human histories cannot delve into. So myth, in its original conception, does not necessarily mean falsehood. The way anthropologists use myth, I think, is very important for us. Anthropologists have often, they are very concerned with myth in their research, and also with ritual, because myth and ritual are intimately connected. And no anthropologist would ever define myth as a false story, as a fairy tale, as something that is just made up. My favorite definition of myth comes from one such anthropologist. His name is Bruce Lincoln, and he defines myth as ideology in narrative form. Ideology in narrative form. So, with this sort of myth, then, you're not. It's actually the opposite of falsehood, because it's a story that brings together all of those things that your culture, your society finds to be most true about itself, about the world it lives in, about how to function in this world. So these are truth statements, but they're not factual truth statements. There's something a little deeper than fact. Okay? I think even that phrase, that definition, is maybe a little problematic to us, because ideology has been kind of drug through the gutter by so many of our politicians and by false prophets and so on. Ideology doesn't have to be something dirty and yucky. Ideology can be pure and true and good, and I would dare say that Christians have to have an ideology, principles that we are going to stand on and proclaim and declare as being true. Things that are kind of are dogmas, I would say, are ideological. So a myth is a story that tries to encapsulate that ideology, those cultural values, those cultural truths in a narrative. Okay? Bruce Lincoln is not the only one to give us a good definition. I was looking for a Catholic definition, and I found one from a saint, Saint John Paul II. He tells us, and this is at the very beginning of his papacy, he was giving a general audience in 1979. So very early in his papacy, and this is actually part of a series of his general audiences that would be compiled into what is called the original unity of man and woman. It's a part of his theology of the body. Speaking on the creation story, the story of Adam and Eve, he writes this. Following the Yahwist text, remember the Yahwist from last module? Here he is again. So Pope John Paul, not only is he going to define myth here, but he refers to our old buddy the Yahwist. Following the Yahwist text, in which the creation of woman was described separately, Genesis 2, verses 21 through 22, we must have before our eyes at the same time that image of God of the first narrative of creation. In language and in style, the second narrative keeps all the characteristics of the Yahwist text. The way of narrating agrees with the way of thinking and expressing oneself of the period to which the text belongs. Following the contemporary philosophy of religion and that of language, it can be said that the language in question is a mythical one. In this case, the term myth does not designate a fabulous content, but merely an archaic way of expressing a deeper content. Without any difficulty, we discover that content under the layer of the ancient narrative. It is really marvelous as regards the qualities and the condensation of the truths contained in it. All right? So, Saint Pope John Paul II tells us that there is myth in Genesis 2. You don't have to listen to the rest of the module. I've answered my question, right? But please do. Yes. So Pope John Paul tells us that there's myth in Genesis 2, and he tells us that myth, he gives us this definition. I'm going to read it again. Please pay attention. In this case, myth does not designate a fabulous content, but merely an archaic way of expressing a deeper content. One more time. Myth does not designate a fabulous content, but merely an archaic way of expressing a deeper content. So, myth is a way of addressing truths that are so profound that they can't just be laid out in a matter-of-fact manner. You have to use this archaic language. I think what he's saying is narrative. You have to use story and symbol to convey these profound truths. And that's what the author of Genesis 2 has done. Notice he also addresses, he doesn't refer to the priestly author, but he does address the earlier creation narrative in Genesis 1, and he talks about how these two creation stories have been put together. They've been put side by side in such a way that when you read the second creation story, you are supposed to recall the first, which talks about the image of God. So he's actually doing a lot of fabulous Old Testament theology right here in this text, and he's doing it in a way that makes use of higher critical thought, but is not beholden in a slavish way to it. It goes beyond it, pointing at the spiritual content, the revealed content in these texts, and it's not just interested in who wrote what when, right? So I really love this quote from Pope John Paul. That's probably why I read part of it 3 times. So what are some other examples? So we have one example of myth in the Bible, right here in Genesis chapter 2, according to Pope John Paul. I didn't say it. Pope John Paul says this. What are some other examples? I'm going to give you 3. Okay? The first one is actually from Genesis 1. So that first creation narrative that we talked a little bit about in the first module, I want to talk a little bit more about it here. And if you recall, the whole point of that first creation story in Genesis 1 through Genesis 2, really 2:4. So in that creation story, we think that was written by priests, and the whole point of it is to depict the world as a temple in which God is to be worshipped by his priests, man and woman, right? It's a liturgical text. The pinnacle of creation is not humankind. We're right up there at the top, but the real pinnacle of creation is the Sabbath, which is humankind worshiping God in a liturgical service, bringing all of his gifts together and giving them back to him. Okay? So that's the point of Genesis 1. What's fascinating is the authors of Genesis 1, who we believe were priests, and we believe they were probably writing after the Babylonian exile. And the reason we think they're writing after the Babylonian exile is because they riff off of an older creation story that comes not from the Bible, not from the Jewish people, and not from the Hebrews, but comes from the Babylonians. And I'm going to tell you that story now. Okay? This story is called Enuma Elish, and it is an ancient story. There are a couple different versions of it, but Enuma Elish is the Babylonian creation account, and it goes something like this: Enuma Elish, when on high, there was no God above. There was no earth beneath, there were no heavens, there was no ground, there were not reeds growing on the shore of the river. There was just water. Water, water everywhere. And her name was Tiamat. And Tiamat, the salt water, had a consort named Apsu, the sweet water. And Tiamat and Apsu, they mingled their waters together, if you know what I mean, and they produced the gods that were born of their union. Let me just clarify here. Tiamat and Apsu are these water spirits. They're also chaotic spirits. So in the beginning, you don't have any order. There is no, there's not really a material world per se. There's just chaos. There's darkness and there is water. Okay? So they give birth to the gods, and the gods begin to fashion a world of sorts. The problem with the gods is that they like to party, and they're very, very noisy. And poor Apsu couldn't get any sleep. So, Daddy needs some rest. And finally, he's had it up to here with those crummy gods, his children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, and he puts together a plot to kill the whole lot of them. Unfortunately for Apsu, fortunately for everyone else, the gods catch wind of it, especially a god named Ea, who is kind of the god of magic in the Mesopotamian mythos. So Ea, he puts together a plan to stop Apsu before he can come and annihilate them, and he sneaks into his palace, he kills him, throws him into a well, and then takes his grand vizier, Mumu, and stuffs Mumu on top of Apsu, and this is the reason that when you dig into the earth, invariably you will eventually hit sweet water welling up out of it, because Apsu is still down there. Okay? So that's enough of Apsu. Mumu is really important because if it weren't for Mumu, all of the sweet waters, the fresh waters, would come up out of the earth and they would inundate it, which actually happens in other stories, right? We see the waters of the great deep breaking forth and flooding the world. And so he has to be corked in by his Grand Vizier Mumu, and Ea uses a special magical incantation to keep him there. A little fascinating aside, fascinating to me at least, this same concept shows up in Jewish literature many times. According to one story that I know of, it shows up in the Prayer of Manasseh. It's alluded to briefly, but when David is building, he's actually laying the foundation for the temple. He won't build the temple, his son will, of course. But when King David is laying the foundation for the temple, he asks some of the workers to move a stone that he thought wasn't in the way, the stone that Abraham slaughtered Isaac on. So he asks them to move that stone, and when they pick it up, water begins to flood the earth. And so they put the stone back and nothing will stop it, and eventually they have to say a special prayer and they have to inscribe God's name on the stone to keep to act as a seal to keep the floodwaters from coming out. And I think it's related to the same story. But in any case, back to Tiamat. So Tiamat is mourning her husband, Apsu. Another aside, I think this stuff's interesting. Apsu, we still have this in our word abyss. So your word abyss comes from the Greek word abyssos, which is taken from this old, they got it from the Assyrians or Babylonians, who would have gotten it from the Sumerians, actually. So this is a very, very, very old word, abzu, the abyss. So Tiamat now, she mourns her husband, but doesn't really think much of it, and time goes by. And then, generations later, Ea has a grandson named Marduk. Marduk will become the Babylonian god of storm. He's incredibly important. He is the major deity of Babylon. Okay? So he is delighted with his grandson Marduk, and he gives him a lot of gifts. And one of the gifts that he gives him is a bag of wind, a wind bag. And Marduk, he would love to go and play with his wind bag, and he would go to the shore, and he'd open up his bag of wind, and it would blow around, and it would blow over the waters, and it would blow dust into the waters, and Tiamat then would become irate. And she couldn't stop Marduk from doing all of this stuff. And eventually, she got so fed up with it that she too decided she was going to kill all of her children, grandchildren, everyone. So Tiamat prepares for war. She does this by selecting a new husband named Kingu. And Kingu, like Tiamat, seems to be a kind of a dragon, a sea monster. Okay, so we have these two gigantic sea dragons, chaos monsters, and she also produces a brood of other dragons and monsters and weird creatures, chimeras mostly. So you have the Mushmachu dragons, who have venom for blood. You have the scorpion men, the fish-headed men, the bull-headed men, all sorts of these conglomerations of different animals with human beings. And so she has this huge army, and again the gods find out that they are in danger. And so they do what anyone would do when they're trying to make an important decision. They have a beer party. And all of the gods come together, and they're enjoying drinking sweet, it says, this is almost a quote from Enuma Elish, they drank a sweet beer through their straws. I guess that's how you drink Mesopotamian beer, is with straws. And when they're all feeling really nice, I mean, this is how it describes it. They're all loose and a little bit drunk, probably. Then they all declare Marduk to be their champion. Marduk says, "Sure, I'll go fight Tiamat for you, on one condition. I want you to give me the power of divine fiat. I want to be able to call things in and out of existence." And they say, "Sure, just get rid of her for us." And so they give him the power to make, to create, and to destroy with his word. And he tries it out. He says, "Let there be a star," and a star shines in their midst. And he says, "Let the star be destroyed," and the star disappears. So, then Marduk goes to war. And he takes his wind bag. Remember, he is a god of storm. He has a bow with a lot of arrows. These would be his lightning bolts. And he marches out, one god, against this huge army. And Tiamat, she goes out before her army to devour Marduk. And it says she opens her mouth, and she's just about to swallow him whole. And Marduk opens his wind bag, and the winds fill up Tiamat's mouth. They fill up her belly. She begins to blow up like a balloon, and then Marduk draws his arrows, and he shoots her. Pop! And that is the end of Tiamat. All of her army immediately surrenders. Most of them he domesticates and makes his own monsters. So the Mushmachu dragons are still around in Babylon, but now they serve Marduk and not Tiamat. Then Marduk does some very interesting things. He looks at Tiamat, and he says, "Here's a lot of potential here. I can make something out of her corpse." And so he carves her body right down the middle, and he takes the upper half of her body, and he throws it up into the sky. Remember, Tiamat is a water dragon. So he takes the waters from her top half, and he makes them the waters above the earth in the skies. Okay? And then he takes her bottom half, and he makes those the seas. And so when you go to the ocean, you are gazing upon Tiamat's body. And she's still, there's a little life left in her, you might say. So she's still storming against us, right? She's still threatening her chaos against us. And then when you look up into the skies, you see the blue that is like the blue of the ocean, and you see Tiamat's waters up there as well. And sometimes the holes in the heavens open up, and some of her falls down upon us as rain, right? And this is the idea of the Babylonian Cosmos. That's the basic idea. He proceeds to make the rest of the world after that. He has a long process of creation. But it culminates in taking Kingu, her husband, and he takes a bowl and he slits Kingu's throat and he collects all of the blood from Kingu's corpse and he fashions it into the black-headed men. Why does he want to make black-headed people? And the idea is that the gods are tired of doing all this work and preparing their own meals and building things. They want some slaves, and so they create human beings out of monster blood, out of dragon blood. They create human beings, not as someone to love, not as a family, certainly not after the image of the gods, but human beings are created merely as slaves to serve the appetite of the gods and to build things for the gods. And so he makes them, and the whole notion of sacrifice then is explained in these terms, that you give sacrifices to the gods because they're hungry. I almost said hangry. They might be hangry too. If you don't give the gods their sacrifices, they're going to get hangry, and that's why you have floods and diseases and plagues and the coronavirus, right? So we try to appease the gods with our sacrifices. We give them what they need because they're not going to feed themselves anymore. And the other thing that Marduk makes the black-headed men do is he commissions them to build Babylon. And the name Babylon actually is good Akkadian. In Akkadian, Babylon is Bab Ilani. Bab means gate, and Ilani means of the gods. So Babylon is the gate of the gods, and then it ends with the 50 names of Marduk, a long litany of all of these different titles and names by which Marduk is invoked and worshipped. Now, one last thing about Enuma Elish that's really important is its ritual context. The reason they wrote this story is because they recited it every Akitu, the Babylonian New Year. They had their Akitu festival, and the priest of Marduk would come out, and he would bring out the image of Marduk, and he would bring out this text, and he would give it to the king, and the king would have to read the whole thing, start to finish, and he had to recite it just right in order to hold Tiamat at bay. Remember, she's dead, but there's still this possibility that she could come back. And if she came back, that would not be good. Her chaos would overwhelm us. It would throw everything into disorder. And the very carefully ordered civilization of Babylon would come crashing down. And actually, in the annals of Mesopotamia, it says whenever Nineveh or Babylon, whenever they're defeated in battle, or whenever they suffer a plague, or whenever something bad happens, generally it says in these annals, that year the king did not read the Akitu, did not read the Enuma Elish at the Akitu festival, or he did not read it correctly, or he mispronounced one of the gods' names, or something like this. And as a result, Tiamat came back. So this is their idea. So you have a myth, you have a story, ideology in narrative form, right? And you have a ritual that goes along with the story that brings that story into the present time. So you have the story that reaches back into the very beginning, the origins of human civilization. It reaches back into that prehistoric time, and by reciting the story and doing the ritual that goes with it, you actually bring that story into the present, and you can access the power that is present in the story. You can make contact with the gods who you are celebrating in that story. Okay? So that's one example of a myth. In Genesis 1, it is very clear. I don't think that you can deny this. It is very clear that the authors of Genesis 1 knew the Babylonian creation story. When this story was first unearthed and published, a man named George Smith published it in the mid-19th century as the Babylonian Genesis. And George Smith tried to say that actually the creation story in Genesis is just a knockoff. Like it's a lesser rendition, like a reboot of the original, and so it was a way of discrediting the Bible. Remember, in that kind of Enlightenment era, that hypercritical, very self-assured approach that these Bible scholars had back then, that was pretty normal to kind of explain away stories like this in the Bible. If you'll also remember, Darwinism was coming into its height at that time. So this was a way of dismissing one creation account so as people would be more accepting of a newer creation account. I think there's some ideology going on here for sure. But I hope you can tell, as I told that story, and I think I did a pretty faithful retelling of Enuma Elish. As I was telling that story, I hope that didn't remind you too much of Genesis. Because it's obvious to me that Genesis is not just a reboot of Enuma Elish. It is a unique creation. But the authors knew Enuma Elish. And there are a few ways that we can prove this. Looking at Tiamat is probably the easiest. So when you look at Tiamat, remember she is divided, and Marduk takes the upper portion of Tiamat and he creates the heavens, and he takes the lower portion and he creates the seas. Well, in Genesis 1, we see God doing the same thing with the waters. He divides water from water, and he takes the waters above and he makes them the heavens, and he takes the waters below and he turns them into the seas. So that's a very clear echo, I think, of Enuma Elish. Shouldn't bother us, but it's there. There is myth in the Bible. I'll explain a little bit of what's going on there, so bear with me. I'm getting to that. Another place that we see this, in whenever you see the word deep in Genesis 1, or abyss, it depends on which translation you're reading, that word in Hebrew is Tehom. Can you hear how Tehom and Tiamat are cognates? Tehom, Tiamat. They're really the same word. And so in the very beginning of the creation story, we hear that there was darkness over the face of the deep. And then it tells us something that I find very interesting. Remember, Marduk, he opens his wind, and that's how he defeats Tiamat. In Genesis 1, we hear that the Spirit of God hovered, brooded. There are a lot of different translations of this. None of them catch exactly what the Hebrew says, but the idea is that the Spirit of God is over the face of the waters, somehow fluttering, hovering, brooding over. The word in Hebrew, merachefet, it kind of has a hovering sound to it, right? Merachefet. Can you hear like dove's wings fluttering there? Merachefet. So the Holy Spirit then is brooding over the waters of creation, about to do something with them. And this word ruach, spirit, I think is the correct translation. But sometimes it's translated wind, and wind is a good translation as well. I don't think it's the correct translation. I think the Holy Spirit is there in Genesis 1, but ruach can be translated both as spirit and as wind and as breath, just like pneuma can, which is the Greek word, just like spiritus can in the Latin. So there is this wind from God hovering over the waters. This reminds us of Marduk, of course it does. But there's something different going on here, isn't there? Why would the Jewish priests want to tell the creation story using this older Babylonian story? And if you can recall, maybe you don't know much about this part of Jewish history, but when Nebuchadnezzar conquers Jerusalem and he begins the Babylonian exile, he takes into exile not just everybody. He leaves a lot of the people there. He doesn't take certainly the poor people. He doesn't take people without land. He doesn't take the illiterate people. He takes the nobility and he takes the priests, because they are the people that after he goes away, they could start a new revolution against him. They could act as leaders to help people get their independence back. So he made a very smart move, not a wise move, because it's not in accord with what God wanted for his people, but he made a smart move by removing the leadership from Jerusalem. So he takes all of the nobility and he takes all of the priests out of Jerusalem. So we have priests now in Babylon, and when you read Babylonian sources, and when you read even the text of the Old Testament, a good example of this is right in the book of Daniel, which was probably written centuries after Nebuchadnezzar, but there's a memory about this time. So when we go to Daniel, you go to Daniel chapter 1. So Daniel 1, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came and laid siege to Jerusalem. The Lord handed over to him Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and some of the vessels of the temple of God, which he carried off to the land of Shinar, and placed in the temple treasury of his God. The king told Ashpenaz, his chief chamberlain, to bring in some of the Israelites, some of the royal line and of the nobility. They should be young men without any defect, handsome, proficient in wisdom, well-informed and insightful. Listen to this. Such as could take their place in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Chaldeans. So these nobles and intelligent, already well-educated young men from Jerusalem are to be re-educated, reprogrammed by the Babylonians. So, and how are they to be instructed? In all of the language and literature of the Chaldeans. Chaldean is just another name for Babylonians. So this means undoubtedly Daniel and his friends read this. And not just Daniel and his friends, but all of the priests who are exiled to Babylon. So they know this by heart. They are being forced to do their lessons out of Enuma Elish. They're being forced to write copies of this. They're being forced to recite it. And so they know this story backwards and forwards. And so think about this. Here you are, a Jewish priest. You are trying to serve God in a foreign land, in a foreign tongue. You are being indoctrinated with this other myth, this other story that is trying to explain the reality that you live in now. It looks to you, for all apparent purposes, that Marduk really is greater than Yahweh, because he has overthrown your city, your temple has been desecrated, and the vessels that were used to worship Yahweh in the temple are now being used to worship the Marduk and the other gods of Babylon. And so what happens eventually is a priest, we do not know his name, a priest finally says, enough. I'm going to write my own creation myth. And he takes the raw material of the Babylonian story to tell his own version of how the world came to be. And he writes, I call this a counter myth to the Babylonian creation myth. It's not a parody, because actually the tone of the Babylonian myth is a little more farcical than the Hebrew one. The Hebrew one is lofty and transcendent. It's much more beautiful. I don't care what George Smith says. It's much more beautiful than the Babylonian one. What this author creates out of the Babylonian creation myth is something that is far better than it. And some of the things that he does with this raw material are very profound indeed. So think about it. In the Babylonian creation myth, how does everything start? So you had Tiamat and you had Apsu. Where did they come from? Nowhere. They're kind of primordial chaos, and all things came out of them. And the gods, actually, who create the cosmos, are born out of chaos. So what does the author in Genesis do? He says, no. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, God. Enuma Elish says, Enuma Elish, when on high, there was no God. There were no creation. There was nothing. And the author just says, no. In the beginning, God. God is first, and all creation comes out of him. And so, actually, one of the most profound... We take it for granted. We cannot feel how revolutionary the doctrine of creation ex nihilo is. But this was a major, major leap forward for someone to say that everything was created out of nothing by God. That was revolutionary. No one had ever dreamed of saying such a thing. And then notice in the Enuma Elish, you have Tiamat and the other forces of chaos that are a threat to the gods. They're a threat. They're a real threat to them. They could destroy them. But in Genesis, does it mention any dragons or sea monsters? Actually, it does. If you go to Genesis 1, verse 21, we see the Mushmachu dragons that Tiamat created. But here, she didn't create them, and they are not a threat. Starting at verse 20. Then God said, let the water teem with an abundance of living creatures, and on the earth let birds fly beneath the dome of the sky. God created the great sea monsters, and all kinds of crawling living creatures with which the water teems, and all kinds of winged birds. God saw that it was good. Nowhere in the Babylonian creation story does Marduk say, oh, this is good. Goodness does not exist in the Babylonian creation myth, but Genesis 1 is shot through with goodness. God created the great sea monsters. The word there is taninim. It means the toothy ones. So there they are. The toothy things of the sea. The Mushmachu dragons, if you will. There they are, but they're not a threat. God made them. God's not threatened by them. He made them. He delights in them. So there's a different tenor to all of this. And then I think, to me, the most profound truth, maybe not as profound as creation ex nihilo, but one of the most profound truths of Genesis 1 is in the Babylonian creation myth, in Enuma Elish. Remember, humankind is made from the blood of a dragon to be a slave. In Genesis 1, we're told God created us, man and woman, in his image and in his likeness. And we're not made to be his slaves, but we're made actually to rule over the earth. We're commanded to do so, to be fruitful and to multiply, and to rule over all that lives in the heavens and in the seas and on the land. we were kind of made as co-regents with God. God is obviously the one in charge, but this idea that we are to actually reign here on the earth, no Babylonian priest would have dared to say such a thing in front of Marduk. But the God of the Hebrews is a good creating God who loves us and makes us in his image and desires to share his good creation with us. He actually made it for us. Remember, we were talking about the way the second creation story is juxtaposed with the first. Most scholars believe, and I think they're correct, that the second story is older. By writing this first story and putting it kind of as a prologue to the story of Adam and Eve, what you get is it accentuates the story of the garden. Adam and Eve are put in the garden to keep it and to protect it and actually to work it. So there's work from the beginning, but their work is not like the work of the slaves in Enuma Elish. Their work is actually to protect the garden, to tend it. Why? Not so that they can feed God, who's getting hangry, right? It's for themselves, so that they can delight in the garden and draw their sustenance from it. So human beings, we are made for God, but we also have an end of ourselves. That God made us as distinct creations with great dignity, dignity that is not unlike his, which is shocking, again, from a pagan perspective. To say such things is shocking, but it's right there. From the very beginning, we see a little bit of our destiny, which in Christian theology is stated actually to become like God, to participate in God's very being, in his divinity. That is what he made us for. And you see it right there in the first pages of Scripture. So yes, Genesis 1 is myth. It's a counter-myth to Babylonian creation myth. But it's not just myth. It's a story, it's ideology in narrative form that has many, many profound truths that you can't just... Can you see how, by telling this story this way, it actually has more power than if you just listed the dogmas that we believe in? That's my point here. Let me introduce you to another myth. Okay? In the 1920s, they discovered in northern Syria a tell. It's called Ras Shamra. It's kind of on the border between Syria and Turkey. And in ancient times, it was known as Ugarit. And they found all of these tablets there, and we believe that Canaanite mythology actually has a lot in common with the mythology in these tablets from Ugarit. And one of the stories, actually several tablets, is the story of Baal. It's called the Baal Epic. And I'm going to read you a little bit of the Baal Epic. In the Baal Epic, Baal Hadad is his name. Baal means Lord. So Lord Hadad has just built a temple palace in which he is to reside and be worshipped on Mount Safon in the north. And he invites all of his friends, his brothers, his sisters, all of the other gods, to celebrate the inauguration of his new palace and his temple. But there's one brother that he intentionally does not invite because he is a party wrecker, and his name is Mot, which is the Ugaritic word for death. So death is not invited to the party. I don't think that's hard to understand why. And so Mot, then, death, he sends a messenger back to Baal Hadad with this message. He says, when you killed Litan, or Litanu, when you killed Litan, the fleeing serpent, annihilated the twisty serpent, the potentate with 7 heads, the heavens grew hot, they withered. So let me tear you to pieces. Let me eat flanks, innards, forearms. Surely you will descend into divine Mot's throat, into the gullet of El's beloved, the hero. So the idea is that Mot swallows up everyone that he encounters, like a dried up olive. Like think about taking an aspirin. That's how Mot swallows you up. It's a very vivid picture of death, isn't it? This personification of death is something that swallows everyone who gets close to him. Well, in the book of Isaiah, starting in chapter 24, there's something the scholars call the Isaiah apocalypse. Again, I'm not too interested in the origins of where this came from, but whoever wrote the Isaiah apocalypse, it's interesting. A lot of people want to say Isaiah could not have written this because it's too apocalyptic. And apocalyptic is late literature. Well, what I just read you from the Baal epic is actually from, we think, around 1400 BC. Okay? That's quite old. And whoever wrote the Isaiah apocalypse is very well acquainted with this story. So, I would say let's not be too hasty in saying Isaiah could not have written this. I think it has more in common with Ugaritic mythology than it does with what we think of as apocalyptic literature. Anyway, I want to draw your attention to 2 parts. The entirety of the Isaiah apocalypse is fascinating. Go read it for yourself. But I want to draw your attention to 2 passages. The first of these is in Isaiah chapter 27, verse 1. And as I read it, you will immediately, I think, hear the resonances with the Baal epic. It's almost a direct quote. On that day, the Lord will punish with his sword that is great, cruel, great and strong, Leviathan the fleeing serpent, Leviathan the coiled serpent. He will slay the dragon in the sea. So, in the Baal epic, we're told that there's this remembrance that sometime long, long ago, before history, Baal slew Leviathan, 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 the fleeing, the coiled serpent. All these words show up there. In fact, some of these words do not show up anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible, but we found them in the Baal epic. Going back a few passages, though, this is my favorite bit. In Isaiah chapter 25, we'll start verse 6. So Isaiah 25, verse 6. On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will provide for all peoples a feast of rich food and choice wines, juicy rich food and pure choice wines. On this mountain, he will destroy the veil that veils all peoples, the web that is woven over all nations. He will destroy death forever. The Lord God will wipe away the tears from all faces. The reproach of his people he will remove from the whole earth. For the Lord has spoken. So looking at the beginning of verse 8, where it says, he will destroy death forever. In Hebrew, what it literally says is death will be swallowed up forever. Death will be swallowed up forever. You remember what Mot does? Mot goes around swallowing people. And what Isaiah says is that on the day of resurrection, actually, Mot will be the one getting swallowed. Isn't that beautiful? So yes, there's mythology in the Bible. The authors of the Bible knew the mythology of the peoples around them, and they incorporate mythology into the warp and woof of their own writings. Now, that doesn't mean that everything in the Bible is mythology. Mythology is, it has a very kind of narrow framework that it operates in. I like to say, whenever you're dealing with something that explains why the world is the way it is in terms of cosmology, that's mythology. Cosmology, or let's say cultural institutions. So, for instance, the story of the fall of Adam and Eve, that would also be mythology. The story of the creation of man and woman, woman taken from the rib of man, explaining that she is bone from our bone, flesh from my flesh. That is an attempt, a good attempt, to explain the institution of marriage, for instance, right? So those sorts of stories are mythology. The story of the Exodus, although parts of it has mythological imagery, in the story of the sea, for instance, the crossing of the Red Sea, there's a lot of mythological imagery between God and the sea. It kind of reminds us of Marduk and Tiamat, right? But that story is not mythological because it's set in historical time. It's recording something that the Hebrew people witnessed and experienced. That said, it's not history per se either. And here I want to introduce you to another term that literary critics and anthropologists use that I think is helpful here. I think we can distinguish between myth and epic. An epic is a story that is set in historical time, but it is in contact with the world of myth. So think about, for instance, the Iliad and the Odyssey. So in these two epics written by Homer, our heroes, these are historical figures. Archaeologists think they have discovered Troy and determined that there really was a great war that was waged there. All of this is rooted in history, and yet, as you read those stories, the action is going back and forth between Olympus and the councils of the gods and the actions of the heroes who are actually fighting the battle, and the things that happen to Achilles and to Odysseus and to the other heroes in the story are actually results of things that are going on with the gods. That's kind of what happens as we read the Hebrew Scriptures. The point is, the stories are not told to lay out a real, let's say, a flat chronological narrative of history and how it went down. They have an agenda, which is to make us alert to how God has operated in history. They want to help us see where God is in history. And if that means conflating a couple of historical events or getting things out of order, that's not their concern so much. They're not. None of the even historical writers in the Bible, none of them intend to write a history per se, not from a modern point of view. They're trying to show how God is leading the story of humankind to a particular goal. Where has God showed up in human history? Where have people met God, encountered God, received revelation from God? And that's a very different thing from telling a kind of objective history of the world, isn't it? Neither would I say is there science in the Bible. The Bible is simply not concerned with those sorts of questions. I'm not going to read this, but in dealing with questions of inerrancy, are there errors in the Bible which are related to this? I would direct you to paragraphs 6 and 11, or sections 6 and 11 in De Verbum, the Constitution on the Word of God from Vatican II. All right, so read De Verbum, sections 6 and 11, if you're interested in what does the Catholic Church have to say about inerrancy. Are there errors in the Bible? There, I think it's pretty clear. De Verbum says that Catholics have to believe that there are not errors properly understood in the Bible. But that kind of depends on what you're looking for. So if you're looking for, let's say, a scientific account of creation or evolution, you're not going to find it there because the authors weren't intending to write that. If you're looking for matters of faith and morals, if you're looking for a revelation of who God is and what God intends for us, you can trust the Bible to tell you what God wants to tell you there. So there are not errors. What I'm saying is you have to frame the question, are there errors? You have to frame it correctly. You can't treat the Bible unfairly. You can't go looking for things in the Bible that the authors of the Bible never intended to address.